I played chess since I was, single digits. I know I learned about 6 or 7 years old. So I've been playing chess, pretty much my whole conscious life. And then when I was around 12, I picked up, there was a company called Avalon Hill. I picked up a game of Battle of the Bulge, and, that kind of got me into the world of board wargaming, and I never looked back. Well, I mean, I played games, all through my teen years, and I was in college, and I went to the first Origins, which is a big game, was the first time they were having like a game convention of this kind of stuff in 1975, I believe. And I just finished my junior year in college, and of course, this is the old days. Like, they didn't have all these internships. Life was a lot less pre-programmed in those days. Kids didn't have, kids went out and played without having like 28, activities that their parents set up for them and all this kind of stuff. It was just it's a black and white world. There were a lot of things not to recommend it, but there were a lot of things that do recommend it. And it certainly was not as structured, which is, I think, a good thing. So as I got through college, now I'm going to be a senior in college. I'm saying, oh, what am I going to do with my life after this? And my mother had a view. She wanted me to be a lawyer. And I had a view. I don't know what I had a view of, but I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I went to this first game convention. I said, hey, I really like these games. Maybe I can get a job doing this. And so I went to this booth of this company called SPI. And I talked to them, and they said, well, if you want to, we like to get to know you. Start coming around Friday nights and, play test, and we'll get to know you. So in my senior year, I used to drive in from Stony Brook, New York, which is, out in eastern Long Island. And I used to drive into the city on Fridays, about once or twice a month. And I would play games at SPI on Friday nights and play test. And it went pretty well. And that I graduated. And in that summer, I was working I was a bill collector. I was a muscle man for a newspaper. And I was a gardener before that. And so I got tired of manual labor. I got tired of the, just walking around collecting bills. And I called up SPI. I said, hey, is there any openings? It just so happened that their high school receptionist was going back to school, and they needed a new receptionist. So I became the receptionist for a game company. And then soon thereafter, they had a need for somebody to, and I had, in that first month on the, as a receptionist, I was also the receptionist, and it was like a small retail. It didn't see many people, but I knew all the games, and I was in the R&D staff technically. And they had just done a game for the Army called Firefight. And they had a series of all the U.S. Army manuals. Total, I'm 6'1", there was about 7 feet of manuals. I read in 1 month, I read all 7 feet of manuals. So I became the guy who knew more about modern warfare than anybody else. And they had this modern game called October War that they wanted a designer for because somebody else had fallen behind. They gave it to me, and I got off the desk. I was within a month, and I was now a full-time designer, and I did 18 games in 2.5 years when I was at SPI, and that's kind of my start. The head of the company was a guy named Jim Dunnigan, and his cohort, the graphics artist who co-owned the company with him was a guy named Herman Simonson. So, I mean, if you know anything about this industry, those two are the big, the big greats. Jim's still around, thank God, and I still see him. Redmond's passed away, sadly, but those two guys, I apprenticed under them. They taught me how to be a game designer and how graphic art fit into game. I mean, it's just, it's something that doesn't even happen anymore, but that's the story of my game design career, early game design career. I was working as a full-time defense consultant in Washington, D.C., and I was still doing, games, as a side job. And a good friend of mine who also recently passed away, named Richard Berg, good friend of mine, we were very close. He started a small game company called, I want to call it SDI. It was like Systems Design Incorporated. It was the takeover of SPI. And I was doing this game called The Great Battles of Alexander the Great, and which became the Great Battles of History series. And Richard, I guess, decided that the company wasn't going to make he wasn't making enough money, and it wasn't going to go, and so he sold me as an indentured servant to this company called GMT Games. So this game that I was doing for Richard became a GMT game, and it came out around 1990, I want to say 1991, somewhere in that ballpark. And that started a 13-14 game series that Richard and I did after I did the original game. We did SPQR and on and on and on, and some of those games were computerized by a company called Interactive Magic. And we won a bunch of awards as a computer game, Windows game, and then now I was working with GMT and Gene, and so this is like the very beginning, just Gene and a couple of guys, and so I started working with them, and it's been a long relationship since then. I guess it's almost going on. Oh my goodness, it's like almost 30 years. The idea and the creation part is actually very quick. I mean, when I did Fort Sumter, I had the prototype done in less than a day, and I was already playing it. It's the development and it's the amateur part, the inspirational design part, which is fun, for me is very short. I mean, like I know what I want to do. I start designing. I build a prototype, and I just start working the prototypes for a while until I get something that I really start to like, and then that's the process. But if you can't get a prototype of a game together, if you think you're designing a game and you don't have a prototype within 3-4 days of starting the project, then you're not serious. So I've been very interested in doing political military games for quite a period of time, and I did this game called PREOCESS. And so I had kind of developed a feeling for how to use, remember the original game is physical, how to use these wooden cubes and how to represent a crisis was what I was trying to get at. And so, it just kind of blended off of that idea of, using, in that game, it used something called strategos, but the idea was that you're using political capital to achieve something. And so, and then there's a famous book on the game of Go done by a guy named Paul Bracken, which talks, and they use Go as a metaphor of multiple dimensions of society and all that, which I read, 100 years ago. But I was always taken by this idea of taking an abstract strategy game and tying it into these various layers where you have the political layer, there's a social layer, there's a military layer, and that the game is representative of that kind of ethos. And so I was using that metaphor to play when I designed Fort Sumter. It was based on my card-driven game system, so I already knew the mechanic. And the real trick was, and there was multiple, there was at least a dozen versions of Fort Sumter, and the early ones were more complicated, and I used my wife as a sounding board. So she'd play, too complicated. So I kept smoothing it down, really boiling it down to what, the final version. She liked the final version, and I think what it was is the hardcore gamers that have traditionally, gotten my games, they all liked the first version. And as I got closer to where Carol was happy, it's my wife, they liked it less. But then all of a sudden, all of her friends wanted to play, and other friends who were like lighter gamers liked it. So there's a trade space here. But as you move towards Carol's end of the spectrum, there's a lot more people who play games. When you move towards the hardcore version, they're happier with all the detail and stuff, but it's a small. So Fort Sumter was always an experiment trying to go more towards the good gameplay with a good historical basis, but not overwhelming you with all of that, mechanical stuff. A lot of the heavy gamers were like, oh, it's just historically themed. It doesn't have a lot of details. That it plays in 20 minutes. I mean, what do you think? There's a trade. Yes, the 6-hour game that you want it to be is not going to be a 20-minute game and have all that stuff in there. It's got to move, and I think it captures the event very well. It just doesn't get into like 28 tons of detail that are really not necessary in this kind of game. It was meant to be a, quick, lightweight game, which I think but it has a lot of strategy and detail. As it's a lot. It fools you. You think it's like simpler than its complexities in its strategy, not in the gameplay. And remember, it was meant to be a crisis. So part of the game is, if it's a long game, it's not going to feel like a crisis. So the idea is that the shortness of the game is also indicative of like this thing. There's an election, and then within, so the election happens in November, and by April they're shooting guns at each other, and a civil war has begun. So I wanted there to be a very fast-paced, feel of this, impending, crisis, and then as one side pushes too hard, remember there's the different zones, the tension zone, so you get some bonuses, but then the peace commissioner comes in, when you push too hard, the other side starts to push back. If you go hard into the final crisis, you lose constituents because you lose a victory point. I mean, all that is tied into the actual sort of the broad sense of that crisis, and I think it captures it. But of course, if you want like lots of things to pull and do, you think there's not enough game there, and I just disagree with that. I think the biggest problem it suffers from is the topic. Most people don't know anything about it other than Fort Sumter, they shot at each other, but they don't know how that crisis came about. And so I think the game communicates some of that with the personalities and the different events. So hopefully there's a sort of a little bit of an educational side to it. But I know couples who have told me they've played the game, 45 times, the physical game. So I'm assuming that the computer game, I heard that the computer game was doing rather well lately, with this horrible crisis going on. A lot of people are playing it because it's fast. It moves along. You're not stuck there for all day. I've been playing my Empire of the Sun game a lot online. I've got, there's an online game I've been playing in, and a friend of mine now wants me to teach it. It's people are, it's doing quite well. I mean, the game's in its third printing, so, that particular game is doing well. I've got a couple of rule books I'm looking at, but between designing and playing Empire of the Sun, I've been playing some online Vassal games. I have plenty of, where I am is there's tons of choices, but probably my son and I, we mostly only play chess. So, because he's got, got this little girl here, so you don't have time for, and we don't have the table space here for like leaving a game set up for a long period of time. So, it sort of causes, chess seems to be the most popular thing we play up here when I'm playing against somebody else, and there's nobody else here other than my son to play with who wants to play a game, so that's kind of it. Other than the fact that I'm, only interacting with my family in this house that I'm in, which is great. I have my granddaughter here, all this kind of stuff. I'm working, remember, my job doesn't require a staff of people. I'm working on Pacific War right now, which is a reprint of an old game I did back in 1985. I was 31 and a new father when I did that game. Now I'm a new grandfather doing it, a reprint of it. So that's what I'm working on. And my goal is by the end of the year, I'll have finished I was actually on par. I did 3 games already published this year, and then this crisis hit and everything kind of shut down. So I'm going to finish 2 games this year, Pacific War and Rebel Fury. And, that'll be what I do for 2020. And hopefully by 2021, somewhere in 2021, the world, they'll figure out the medical side of this thing, so I can, come out of shelter here and then get on with my life, and we'll get these other games published and do some more. I'll tell you, I mean, I'm always humbled that people play my games. I'm always very appreciative. They let me do what I want to do, and hopefully I'm giving them a lot of pleasure. And like I said, I think Gary did an amazing job implementing Fort Sumter. It's a beautiful. Quite frankly, I would prefer to play now because the setup time is 0. And the AI, I probably play Fort Sumter. I play it mostly on the computer against the computer because in this situation there's somebody around, and online play. And unless I know people, I'm not really just like playing strangers. So most of the games I'm only playing with friends. So. Yeah, it's going well. It's going well, and so I thank everybody, and hopefully, and you should know we're planning on a couple of other games with different themes along this mechanic. So hopefully, folks will dig that.